Welcome everybody on a beautiful Santa Barbara winter day. It's great to have you here. They made me wear this coat today. My students know I don't like to do this, but looking a little dapper today. I'm Dr. Ron C. I'm a member of the psychology department here, a neuroscientist by training. Teach a lot of different kind of stuff, and I just want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us for today's talk. Our guest today is Dr. Carl Trueman. Dr. Trueman comes to us from Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania. Someone knows where it is? Yeah, it's up near Pittsburgh. I've never been, but it sounds like a sweet little place, kind of a college town from what Dr. Trueman tells me. He's a professor of biblical and religious studies there, and his background, he's from the UK, Gloucestershire, is that right? Yeah, got it right, originally. But he earned his master's in classics from the University of Cambridge, and then went on to finish his PhD in church history from the University of Aberdeen up in Scotland. He's taught on the faculties at the University of Nottingham in the UK, University of Aberdeen, and at Westminster Theological Seminary. He's authored over a dozen books, including more recently The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and also a book called Strange New World. And we are really pleased to have him today, and he's someone for me. I teach a history of psychology, and for me as a historian of psychology and neuroscience, a lot of the insights he gives in kind of how thinking evolves over time through different important intellectual figures going back even 300 years has really shaped the nature of what we see the self today, and particularly in the Western world. And so it's been a real pleasure getting to talk with him today. He's visited several Westmont classes, met with students and faculty, and we are glad to have you here today, Dr. Trueman. So please welcome Dr. Trueman as he comes up to tell us about what does it mean to be human. Dr. Trueman.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you all today. It's an easy sell to get a professor from Western Pennsylvania to come to California in, I was going to say January. It feels like January in Western Pennsylvania. It's actually February. I was out clearing snow just a few weeks ago, and I think the wind chill was minus 50. I lasted for about 15 minutes and then had to head inside. So it's a real pleasure to be with you today. It's a pleasure to be at Westmont. I want to give my thanks to Ron and Charlie for setting this all up, and also to President Beebe for a very pleasant afternoon today. My topic is, what does it mean to be human? I'm actually, by background, a Reformation stroke 17th century academic. One of the things that has always interested me is why people think the way they do. Why do some ideas gain traction and other ideas disappear? I've also always been interested in the fact that not everything that presents itself to us as an intellectual problem necessarily has an exclusively intellectual origin. I was teaching a class on John Locke just yesterday at Grove City College, and I made the point that you cannot understand John Locke's epistemology unless you set it against the background of some of the political issues that he's having to address in late 17th, early 18th century England. There are many things one could say about the politics of the present day. It's been interesting. I've been in the States now, I think, for nearly 22 years. I emigrated literally 3 weeks before 9/11. It's been fascinating to be an immigrant in a country that has completely transformed in the space of 2 decades. The kind of politics and political issues we face today are really not the issues that marked America or marked the West when I arrived in 2001. A lot of our politics today revolves around issues of identity. And I'm sure I need to list the kind of hot-button identity issues for you. But what I want to suggest in this lecture is this, that before we address issues of identity, we need to reflect upon what I think is an underlying issue. And the underlying issue is the problem of what it now means to be a human. I don't intend in my lecture today to provide any answers. I see my task as a historian as being twofold. I picked up from my doctoral supervisor many years ago, the task of the historian is, one, to make things more complicated, and two, to help clarify the kinds of questions we should be asking. So I'm not intending today to to advocate for any particular position or idea. What I want to do is clarify the question that I think we need to be asking. I'd also add just at the start that the lecture already feels somewhat out of date. What I'm going to focus on in this lecture is the role of technology in reshaping the way we think of what it means to be human. I wrote the lecture 3 weeks ago, before ChatGPT was even a thing in my universe. I did wonder this week, should I go back and add a section on that? Well, first of all, I write my lectures in ink, so it's very difficult to go back and add a section. And secondly, I simply haven't reflected enough on the significance of ChatGPT in order to be able to speak thoughtfully or intelligently on it. At the end of the lecture, some of you may think that I've not reflected on anything I say in order to be able to reflect thoughtfully and intelligently on it. And you are free to do that. But ChatGPT is certainly something that I am not qualified to comment on. But ChatGPT represents, of course, the challenge of artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence raises questions about what it means to be human. I think the COVID crisis and the agonies that many went through over lockdown and isolation raise questions about what it means to be human. I read the British press every day. The saddest picture I ever saw during the time of COVID was the funeral of a little 10-year-old Muslim boy. He died in a British hospital suffering from COVID. He died alone because his parents were not allowed to be there and hold his hand. And he was buried alone. The picture of his funeral was a tiny little coffin carried by presumably a member of the local mosque and the imam there to say the prayers. And to me, I remember looking at that picture and thinking, that's dehumanizing, that a 10-year-old boy would die alone without his parents. COVID raises questions for us, I think. Isolation has raised questions for us about what does it mean to be human? I'm fascinated by the rise of social media as a primary way of forming relationships. I don't do social media myself. I don't understand it. It's not a medium with which I sympathize, but most of my students, like many of you, it's a very real thing to them. It is a way they get their validation. Think about it. When I was at school, I had 6 or 7 friends. They were real friends. They were bodies that I knew in the class. And if we fell out, I knew straight away we'd fallen out because I would see it in their faces. And we would remedy the situation generally. I just needed the approval of 5, 6, 7 guys. I went to an all-boys school. 5, 6, 7 guys to feel happy about myself. When you have hundreds of friends on Twitter or on Facebook, you make yourself very vulnerable to the opinions of people you don't even know. That's why many of you struggle with anxiety. What does social media do to what it means to be human? So that's what I want to address today. But before we get there, I want to make a distinction. I don't know what the technical philosophical jargon for this distinction would be, but I want to make this distinction. I want to say that human beings are unique among creatures on the face of the earth because what we are and who we are somewhat separable. I can look out at the faces in front of me, and I know what you are. You are all human beings. And it really tells me nothing of significance about you, and really doesn't tell me anything that you consider to be significant about yourself. If I ask you afterwards to tell me about yourself, you don't give me your blood group. You don't tell me about your genome. You tell me about who you are, not what you are. You tell me about the decisions and choices you've made in your time. I'm privileged to live in Western Pennsylvania. One of the things I love about Western PA is the wildlife. It's not always great. I was woken up yesterday morning at 5 o'clock by the coyotes howling. It's kind of creepy when you realize that a coyote is just outside your back window. There's a beautiful fox that lives at the bottom of my garden. If you've seen one fox in the presence of a chicken, you have seen all foxes in the presence of a chicken. I've seen a fox, I haven't seen a fox kill a duck, I've seen a fox I haven't seen a fox kill a chicken. I've seen a fox kill a duck. What a fox is and who a fox is, it's not a meaningful distinction. Fox is a beautiful, instinctive killing machine. My wife and I were proud. She would say parents. It always made me cringe when people talk about their pets as their children. My wife would say we're the proud parents of a Jack Russell Terrier. I'd say, it doesn't look anything like me. It doesn't look anything like you. How can we be parents of this thing? Jack Russell Terriers, he had his own personality, and guess what? It was exactly the same as the personality of every other Jack Russell Terrier on the face of the planet. Greatest dogs in the universe. Crazy. And all of them are crazy. What a Jack Russell Terrier is in general, and who a Jack Russell is in particular, two sides of the same coin. We might put it this way. Think about beavers. Beavers build dams. Human beings design and build houses. Bees produce beautiful honeycombs. Human beings can paint and sculpt great works of art. We are not just creatures of instinct. We are creatures of intention. We choose, to an extent, who we are and what we do. And I want you to bear that in mind, because now I want to move to my next point, and that is, I want to take us back to a dramatic representation of a medieval legend. Many of you are probably familiar with the story of Dr. Faustus, or Dr. Faust, the man who sells his soul to the devil for certain worldly pleasures and privileges. The most famous version, I think, in the English-speaking world is that produced by Christopher Marlowe. Perhaps the most philosophically impressive articulation of the Faust legend, however, is that written by Goethe, the great German writer and thinker. And I want to quote a bit from the scene near the start of Goethe's Faust Part 1, where Mephistopheles, the demonic devil figure, confronts Faust and tempts him. Mephistopheles says this: "My dear sir, you're looking at things in a conventional way. We must do better than that, or the joys of life will escape us. Hang it! You have your hands and feet. You have a headpiece and a codpiece. And anything else you can enjoy is yours, isn't it?" And then it's this last section that I think is so important for what I have to say. "If I can afford a coach and six, isn't their energy my energy? I can ride around proudly as if I had 24 legs." Faust is confronted there by Mephistopheles with what I might call the technological temptation. What is the technological temptation? Well, I think in some ways you could divide it into two, and I want to talk a little bit about both of them this time. The first one is this. The first temptation is to see the world as raw material for our wills. And you'd have to be pretty naive, I think, in the world today, looking around the world today, to say that that is not something in general that certainly Western societies have embraced passionately. We have often seen the world as a place to be exploited in order to fuel or make our kinds of life possible. That's part of the technological temptation. The second part, and this is the one that I really want to focus on today, though it's not unconnected to the first. The second is this: to see ourselves as some things that are to be transcended. Technology tempts us to think of ourselves as something that should be transcended. I could return to my earlier distinction and put it this way. Technology tempts us to detach the who question almost entirely from the what question. Technology says to us, really, it doesn't matter what you are, who you are. That's the prize. And technology enables you to realize yourself in a way that you could never have imagined prior to the advent of technology. And it fuels that intuition, doesn't it? The intuition that we are free, sovereign individual wills. If there is one dominant myth, and by myth, by using the word myth here, I'm not making any comment on whether it's true or false at this point in the lecture. I mean a story or an idea that shapes the way we imagine ourselves and the world in it, and is therefore real in that sense. The dominant myth of the modern world is men and women are born free and everywhere are in chains. Rousseau's myth. And technology allows that to dig even deeper, I think, into our souls. Technology promises freedom. I could give another lecture, of course, on whether technology actually does deliver that. I used the example in class earlier today. I was in Dallas-Fort Worth Airport yesterday and suddenly realized that I'd chosen where I was sitting because there was a power socket nearby. I needed to charge my cell phone. How free am I? Has technology liberated me, or has it enslaved me to the cell phone? One could give a lecture on, has technology really freed us, or has it simply made us slaves? I throw that out there. For this lecture, I simply want to think about how technology feeds the intuition that we are individual and sovereign. Okay, let me give some examples of this. Let's start with a really controversial one. Music. Think about music. Some of you did not expect me to go there, I'm sure. Music. Think about music. Think about music historically. 200 years ago, you wanted to enjoy music. And as far as I'm aware, I've not come across a culture on the face of the planet that does not have music. 200 years ago, you want to enjoy music, you want to be involved in music. What did you have to do? You had to go somewhere where it was being performed, or you had to be part of a group that was performing it yourself. Societies, as I say, across the face of the planet have always placed, as far as I can see, a high place on music. Music marks key events. Weddings, full of music. People celebrate births with music. Death, lamentations, often accompanied by particular forms of music. Parties, music. Think about that. Music has, in its origin, an important communal purpose. What does music do in that form? It draws you together with others. It kind of negates your individual sovereignty. Because in order to enjoy music, you've got to be part of a group performing it. It is a communal experience. As I said, the important communal experiences of life, birth, marriage, death, were shared and expressed in musical form. When cultures have felt particular pain at points, music has been a sort of survival mechanism, or part of the survival mechanism. Think of the African American spiritual tradition. Think of the tradition of blues that has emerged from it. Think of the Psalms of the Old Testament. Think of the Psalms of the Old Testament. Israel giving voice to her deepest experiences through the language and the music that was communally produced. Think of traditional pop culture, not modern pop culture, traditional low culture. The tradition of ballads and folk songs that many cultures have. Music arose out of, was reflected by, and was constitutive part of communal life. And it was of necessity live. Think about that. One of the ways that you would know that you are not a sovereign individual would be music. Music. Woven into the very fabric of the social and cultural life that you enjoyed or experienced. Now think about today. I love music. I'm very eclectic. Everything from Renaissance, polyphony, all the way through to, well, for me, classic rock ends in about 1981. I grant, death of John Bonham of Led Zeppelin, for those of you of a certain age, maybe you're the only person who gets the reference, I don't know. 1980, John Bonham of Led Zeppelin dies. Classic rock really deteriorates pretty rapidly after that, as far as I'm concerned. I love music. Music fills my life. But here's the rub. I get to a live concert. I get to live concerts or recitals at the college 4 or 5 times a year. Maybe I'll go to Pittsburgh and get a concert once a year. Most of my experience of music today is as an individual. I listen to it when I'm running on the treadmill. I listen to it when I'm doing chores around the house. And guess what? I choose the music I listen to. And I consume it as an individual. Think about that. Music has moved from being something that is communally produced to being something that is individually consumed. Now think about that, how that shapes our imagination of how we relate to other people. That which arose precisely because communities existed and communal life was critically important has become the very thing that now divides us off as individuals. I sat on the plane yesterday. I'm one of those types. I can be a terrible snob at points. I sort of despise people who sit on planes with their earbuds in. I'm very sorry if you're one of them. I don't despise you individually. I despise you as a class. That's a fine distinction, I know. I like to read a book. But on both flights yesterday, I was sitting next to somebody with their earbuds in, consuming music as an individual. And the reason they put their earbuds in was they didn't want to speak to me. I'm an antisocial Englishman. Suits me fine. I want to speak to them. It's sort of great from that perspective. But isn't it interesting? Music becomes that which separates and individuates us. And what do you listen to? You listen to what you choose. More so now than ever before. Think of Spotify. When I was growing up, yeah, you could listen to music privately, but the album still had a certain authority. Unless you wanted to risk scratching it. The cassette tape, if you don't know what that is, look it up on Wikipedia. The cassette tape had a certain authority. It's why you could have concept albums. Why you could have Pink Floyd, so that the whole album had to be listened to in order. Now, I have my playlists, over which I am sovereign, which play to my tastes and I play in my time. Think about that. The intuition that we are sovereign individual human beings, that every relationship we have is merely a contractual one, I think it's not unconnected to the way we consume music. Music can't carry the whole weight of it, but it reflects and reinforces something about what we think of as being an individual. Second area, the medical field. Become very interested. I'm an absolute amateur in the area of medical ethics. But medical ethics seem to me to be interesting and something worth watching. Some of you may perhaps are thinking of going on to do academic research after you leave Westmont. I'm a church historian. Don't become a church historian. There are hundreds of us. We're a very easy to find commodity. I think one of the things that we need today in the Christian church is more good ethicists. More good ethicists. Catholicism has many of them. Protestantism, not so many. Not so many. But we need good ethicists because so many medical advances are raising questions that we can't even begin to think about answering. Think about medical ethics. This may be a somewhat black and white way of presenting it, but I would say medicine seems to have shifted over the years from being primarily restorative to being transformative. What do I mean by that? Plastic surgery provides us with a good example. Excuse me. Is there a hole in the top of this? Oh yeah, sorry, I'm going blind in my old age. It's very dry in California, coming from Western Pennsylvania. Medicine, I think, the ethics have shifted from being primarily restorative to being transformative. Plastic surgery is a good example. Now, there are examples from the ancient world of plastic surgery. Primitive skin grafts, primitive what we would now call nose jobs, alteration of those, rhinoplasty. We have examples of those in the ancient world. Plastic surgery is really, truly galvanized in the early 20th century, in the wake of the Great War, 1914 to 1918. The First World War wreaked technologized carnage on human bodies in a way that would have been unimaginable 50 years before. Mustard gas, the emergence of tank warfare, trench warfare with its continual shelling. A whole generation of young British men were either slaughtered or horribly mutilated in the trenches of the First World War. And when those lucky, and I put lucky in inverted commas here, when those lucky enough merely to be mutilated returned home, plastic surgery started to take off. And the idea of plastic surgery there was to try to restore some physical dignity to the young men whose bodies had been so horrifically damaged in the warfare. That was the origin of plastic surgery, really, in the modern era. It was a restorative thing. Now think about the primary purpose of cosmetic surgery today. Certainly there are restorative cosmetic surgeries that go on. People who've been badly burned can have plastic surgery and have some physical dignity restored to them. But I would hazard a guess that the vast amount of money spent on plastic surgery in the United States is not restorative plastic surgery. It is transformative plastic surgery, driven by individuals who regard their bodies as problematic. They want to be better looking. They want to look like, I was going to say Paul Newman, but you may not have heard of Paul Newman. They want to look like a younger version of Tom Cruise or Brad Pitt or something. If I was tempted by plastic surgery, hair and teeth, my two big weaknesses, British dentistry, ancestry, all bald. I was doomed from the word go. My desire for plastic surgery, if I had it, would be to transcend that which I am. Plastic surgery in its cosmetic form involves the attempt to realize a vision that transcends the actual through aiming at some ideal construction of ourselves that we may have. We see it in other areas of medical ethics. Again, I'm not competent to comment on this, but gene editing strikes me as very interesting. The idea now that we can use gene editing in order to design babies seems to be emerging. Think about, it strikes me as odd when Iceland say they have eliminated Down syndrome. Iceland has not eliminated Down syndrome. Iceland has eliminated people with Down syndrome. I don't know how many of you have the privilege of knowing somebody with Down syndrome. The ones I know are among some of the most blissfully happy people I've ever come across. They enrich every life that they touch. But a medical ethics of, well, this is what human beings should be like, and therefore we can eliminate that which does not conform, is kind of emerging. The realities of nature, we might say, being subjugated to the ambitions of desire. Next one, sex. Much could be said on this. I want to focus on three things: the emergence of sex as recreation, the emergence of sex as identity, and the philosophy embodied in pornography. They're all bracketed together broadly under the topic of sex, but when we get to pornography, I will have some different things to say. Think about how certain technologies must exist for sex to be seen primarily as recreation. My wife and I, a few months ago, we were traveling to Philly. We broke the journey in Carlisle, a small town in Pennsylvania, and we went out for dinner. And when we came back from dinner, we found ourselves walking through a pro-abortion protest. My wife feels passionately about these things. I'm just always a teacher. I'm looking around thinking, is there something here I can use to illustrate a class? And one of the banners struck me as very interesting and very eloquent of the point I want to make here. One of the banners said this: consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. Now, setting aside opinions on abortion, think about that statement. Consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. That statement only makes sense in a world that is to some degree technologized in particular ways. Because you would certainly have to say 150 years ago that consent to sex was consent to the possibility of pregnancy. One would have to say that 150 years ago. The reason why the sign makes sense today, of course, is we have easy access to contraceptives, abortion, and antibiotics. Sex is relatively risk-free, we might say, in terms of its consequences today, either in terms of pregnancy or in terms of catching a nasty disease. You can only think of sex as recreation if you assume a certain form of society that has access to certain kinds of technology. By the way, I'm not saying there that those technologies are necessarily bad. I have my opinions on that, but it is not necessary for you to agree with my opinions on that in order to see the point I'm making. You need a certain kind of technology to imagine that sex functions in a certain kind of way. Sex's identity, very briefly, of course, rests on that. Sex's identity ceases to become sex that is typically tailored towards procreation. That is a technologically enabled thing, and that really lays the groundwork for Freud's idea that we are defined by the nature and direction of our sexual desires. It means Freud's idea can get legs and become something that grips the imagination. Now, pornography. Technology's impact relative to pornography, of course, is not so much that it changes what pornography is. If I did classics as an undergrad, wow, there's a lot of pornography in the ancient world, or what we would call pornography. It always struck me as odd when I was doing classics that at school we would be allowed to read Aristophanes' plays, which are full of lewd humor and explicitness. And the very proper Latin teacher that we had, she would be killing herself laughing at the Aristophanes jokes in a way that if somebody on the TV was doing that today, she'd be writing and complaining to the Director General of the BBC. Lewdness, pornography, it's a perennial of human existence. I think it's a particular problem for us today because technology allows its delivery in a way that is unchecked by the traditional methods of social shame. Yeah, when I was a 17, 18-year-old boy, man, if I wanted to get hold of a grubby magazine or I'm not even sure if videos are around when I was age, but let's say I want to get hold of a grubby video. I've got to take the risk of going to that creepy shop. I live next door to the vicar, so I've got to run the risk of the vicar's wife seeing me going in and reporting it to my parents. There were structures of social shame. The deluge of pornography that is now accessible via the internet has transformed the social imaginary, the way society thinks about pornography. It's become a whole lot more acceptable because, hey, everybody seems to be indulging in it. It's transformed sexual expectations. I was having dinner a few months ago with a friend, first time I'd met his wife, and I asked his wife what she did for a living, and she said that she was I can't remember the exact term, but it was something, she was basically a lower stomach, an abdominal, I think it was abdominal physiotherapist. And I said, what on earth is an abdominal physiotherapist? I don't want to be rude, but what on earth do you do? And she said, I work with young girls who have been physically damaged by the sexual expectations of the young man whose sex education comes from watching violent pornography. That is now such a problem, we actually have a profession that you can train for in order to help you deal with it. And I asked her, I said, and what would you say is the biggest thing that you have to try to persuade these girls of? And she said, the biggest problem we face is persuading young women that sex is not necessarily violent and agonizingly painful. So it goes, interesting. That's dehumanizing. That involves a fundamental change. What do we think when we think about pornography? Well, there's the standard objections, aren't there? We think about the objectification of the other. Put it in slightly pretentious terms, we think about the other person, as being turned into a means rather than an end. I would want to suggest we need to go further. Watching pornography actually dehumanizes the one watching. Because sex is meant to be something that finds its significance in the two people involved in the act. When somebody is watching it as spectator sport, something that is very important to human beings is divorced from its context. And the person who divorces it from its context is dehumanized. And I think that's going to be a real challenge. It's just an aside. When you talk about this stuff, you inevitably end up getting into pretty distasteful territory. So I beg your forgiveness in advance for introducing something very distasteful at this point. But we cannot build a sexual ethic purely on the basis of consent. There are now people making sex dolls that look like children. Is it okay to use one? Ask yourself that. Would it be okay to legalize those and allow people to use them? Nobody gets hurt. Nobody gets hurt. I raise the question. I'm not going to answer it for you, but just reflect. Think upon that. Pornography teaches us that the act of sex is isolated from a relational, and dare I say, costly narrative. Traditional views of sex set it within a costly narrative. What do I mean by that? Hey, you're a young guy in the middle of the 19th century, you're 17 or 18. All you want to do is have sex with a young girl. That's all your mind thinks about all the time. What have you got to do? Well, you've got to get a job, you've got to be clean, you've got to persuade her parents and probably her brothers and sisters that you're a safe bet, because if you have sex with her, she may get pregnant. In other words, you've got to heavily invest. Pornography teaches us that sex does not require heavy investment, heavy interpersonal investment. Pornography means, hey, I can make it on my own. I don't have to invest in relationships with others. It may not be quite as good as the real thing, but it's close enough for me not to want to bother making the extra effort at that point. And I would also say pornography does this. It turns desire for a particular person into a general desire for genital satisfaction. And intuitively we know that's not what sex is about. Yeah, there are people who go from one night stand to another. But by and large, desire is particular. Desire is particular. On my wedding day, had it been somebody else, my wife's an identical twin. Had it not been my wife, but her identical twin that I saw when I turned round when the music changed, I would not have married her. Don't tell my sister-in-law I say this because it sounds kind of distasteful. I could have had sexual relations with my sister-in-law, had children with her. She's an identical twin. But that wasn't the point. Sexual desire, I think, properly ordered, is desire not for a body in general, but for that person in particular. And then my final bit of bad news before we try to reconstruct some good news out of this, transhumanism. What is transhumanism? Transhumanism is the desire to transcend biological limitations. We see elements of this, early elements, I think, in the attenuation of the biological family by reproductive technology. Think about that, and it's a difficult area. If you want to ask a question about that, I'm happy to talk about it later. Reproductive technology has brought much joy into the lives of many people. I understand that. But it also shifts the great miracle of life into an arena over which we have a kind of control. And that shifts our understanding of what it means to be a parent or family. Not in any individual case, but in terms of the broader social imagination about that. Notice the cultural shift. I don't know if this is significant, but it strikes me that it probably is. The cultural shift that now sees parenting as a verb. When I was growing up, your parents were just your parents. And nothing they did would break that. Now we have parenting as a verb. Parenting isn't something you are. It's something you do. And that's beginning to creep into American law, actually. I think it would be interesting to watch how family law shifts over the next decade to bringing in the idea that a parent is a function and not a biological relation. That would be a very significant move. Again, touching on that notion of what does it mean to be human? It's a theme in the cyborg feminism of the last 40, 50 years. Shulamith Firestone in the 1970s, Donna Haraway in the 1980s, and Sophie Lewis today. Sophie Lewis's book, Full Surrogacy Now, is fascinating. If you haven't read it, you might want to have a look at it. Because it's addressing an important question. One of the things I think that society has not yet grappled with is what is the legal status of surrogate mothers? This category of woman is comparatively unprotected by law, and I think it's a real problem. And Sophie Lewis is grappling with a big problem here. How do we protect surrogate mothers? Her answer, though, I think, is off the charts. The answer is we abolish natural motherhood, so everybody's a surrogate, and the problem goes away. Think about that. The isolated individual, no longer obliged by links of biology to anybody else. That's an interesting move. The issue of gender. Marx and Engels point in the Communist Manifesto to the clear truth that as automation proceeds in the industrial sphere, so the difference between men and women will vanish or will become mitigated. Medieval blacksmith, you've got to be a pretty burly guy to wield that hammer. Maybe there's some women around who could do it. By and large, you've got to be pretty burly. Notionally, the advisor / aspiring coach of the women's rugby team at Grove City College. It sort of died a death over COVID. You can't put a women's rugby team up against a men's rugby team because it's carnage. Physical size really makes a difference. Video gaming, not so much. No trouble pitching my women's rugby team against the men in a video game competition. Automation reduces the difference between men and women because it reduces the importance of physical strength. Think about that. Technology shapes the way we imagine men and women to connect. And then move to the present day, I would say, on the transgender issue. All I want to say is this. The transgender issue is only imaginable in a world where a certain kind of technology is available. You need a technological world to imagine the transgender issue in the way that it manifests itself today. All of these things are technologically enabled. All of these things transform the intuitive way we think about ourselves and the way we relate to each other, from music through sex to transhumanism, things that are very important to understanding what it means to be a human being, have all been utterly transformed by technology. And I would also say this, they've also tilted us towards thinking that bodily functions and bodily limitations become problems to overcome. They tilt us to that technological temptation to see the world as it is as a comprehensive problem to be overcome. All of these things are enabled by technology. All of these things empower the individual will. All of these things, to return to a distinction I made very early on, all of these things further detach the who of what we are from the what of what we are. The solution, very briefly, because I don't really have a solution, but I'm going to sort of sketch out what I think might be an interesting way to approach this. The solution, I think, has to be in some way, shape, or form, a recapturing of the what we are, an agreement on the what we are that can then ground the who. Easy to say, very, very hard to do. I want to suggest just one way we might want to think about this. I think we need to reflect upon and reassert the importance of our bodies. We need to reflect upon and reassert the importance of our bodies. First of all, I want to say we need to re-grasp the idea that human beings are bodies. We intuitively know that. I did my sort of cheap trick in class today when I called on one of the students by name to make this point, and she looked up at me and smiled. Exactly what I wanted her to do, and I said, I think it was Elise, I think. I said, Elise smiled at me. Notice what I'm saying there. I'm not saying that some spooky component that dwells inside Elise pulled some levers that made her face smile at me. Her face is her. When her face smiles at me, she smiles at me. We intuitively know that our bodies are ourselves. When you kiss somebody, you don't say, I put my lips on that person's lips. You say, I kissed him. I kissed her. We intuitively know that our bodies are an integral part of who we are. Now work out from that. What's one of the implications of that? Well, one of the implications of that is that the idea that we are born free and everywhere in chains has to be highly qualified. Why do I say that? I had the privilege, a year ago yesterday as it happens, to become a grandfather. I got some lovely pictures of my little granddaughter yesterday while I was sitting in the airport. Quite made my day. And at some point early last year, I was giving a lecture in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and for the first time in his life, my oldest son actually turned up to hear his dad speak. He used to hear me preach when I was a pastor, but he never heard me give a lecture. And he brought little Emily with him. He and his wife brought little Emily with him. And halfway through, I decided to use my granddaughter as a prop. I wanted to make a point. Also, I wanted to show her off to everybody. There was definitely a sinful, self-promotional dimension to this. But I asked my son to stand up and hold up little Emily. And she was about 3 months old at the time. And I asked the question, was Emily born free? Nobody said yes. Patently obvious that a 3-month-old child is completely dependent upon her parents. Why? Because she's a tiny little body. Tiny little body that is incapable of feeding and cleaning herself, let alone living in any majorly constructive way. When I was a teenager, I bred hamsters. Do you know that if you breed a hamster, you have to separate the litter at 21 days. They're antisocial creatures. They kill each other after 21 days. You have to separate them. They are free and independent after 21 days. My granddaughter won't be free and independent for many years. To be human is not to be free in the first order. To be human is to be dependent. To be dependent. And that derives from our bodies. Our bodies, if you like, determine our dependencies and our obligations. Just before I spoke this evening, I called my wife. Her mother had a stroke last year, and this week there's been some significant deterioration. And my wife, for the first time ever, she was kind of proud. She managed to have a 3-way conversation on her cell phone, which is a major technological breakthrough for her. I'm not sure I could pull it off now. But she was telling me I spoke to both my sisters simultaneously on 3 different phones. And she made the point there that we're kind of having to parent Mum now. The role that Mum once had for us, we now have for her. Why do my wife and her sisters have that role? They're biologically connected. There's a bodily connection there. They feel an obligation towards the woman who cared for them when they were small and vulnerable. So my wife has never been free. She's always either been dependent or obliged. And that applies to all of us, I think, most of us anyway. Why? Because we're bodies. And I think here we may actually have some ground for pushing back against the culture couple of students have asked me today, so okay, you give us all the bad news. How can we respond to our non-Christian friends, or how can we respond to the culture? Well, I think one of the things that hopefully my reflection has done this evening is to indicate that we don't believe a lot of the stuff. We don't intuit a lot of the stuff we intuit or believe because of arguments. It's more complicated than that. It's kind of the environment we live in. We get these things by osmosis. Well, actually, I think that our bodies give us some intuitive ground for making some pushback cases on some of the stuff that's going on in modern society. Think about the issue of abortion or euthanasia, big issue in society. And arguments fly back from one side to the other with very little fruit, it seems to me. But imagine a little thought experiment. Some of you may know the name Peter Singer. Peter Singer is one of the most articulate and thoughtful advocates for abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia in the Western world. He's an Australian, but he teaches at Princeton. I give him this credit for this. You always know what he's saying. He writes and speaks and thinks very, very clearly. He just happens to be at Princeton University, where Professor Robert George, well-known Catholic thinker, professor of jurisprudence, pro-life advocate, teaches. Think about a scenario where the two of them are walking down Nassau Street in Princeton late one night, and they hear a crying coming from a doorway. And the two of them head over to the doorway, and they see in a little basket there a newborn baby. My guess is there will be no disagreement in that situation between those two men on what should be done. My guess is that Robert George will say, we need to get this baby to the hospital as soon as possible, and we need to find the mother in order to get her help. No doubt that Professor George would say that. I don't think Peter Singer would respond by saying, look, this baby has no consciousness of the future, no intention to move into that future. It's not a person. We can leave it for the feral cats to eat overnight. He's just not going to say that. They're going to be in absolute agreement. Why? Because they're not talking about an abstraction there. They're looking at a little body. Bodies count. We know that. Peter Singer cared for his mother with Alzheimer's and was challenged once by an interview. You can find the interview online. Is that not inconsistent with your view that somebody who has lost their mind ceases to be a person and can be euthanized? And his answer is rather eloquent and rather beautiful. He says, yes, it is, but I guess it's different when it's your mother. Yeah, of course it's different when you're your mother. She fed you at her breast. She put sticking plaster on your knee when it got grazed at school. She was there to comfort you perhaps when you were bullied. Perhaps when somebody badly treated you, your mum still loved you. You had this connection, a bodily connection. Think about sex. I think that we are at a point where the idea of sex as recreation could well collapse. The hashtag #MeToo movement did many good things. But right at the top, I think, was indicating that consent is a very, very problematic thing to establish at law, particularly when you're dealing with a Hollywood mogul and a young woman desperate to get a role in a movie. But secondly, I think it also allows us to think about, why is Harvey Weinstein such a monster? Why is he? Have you ever thought that? Why do we think he's such a monster? Well, you might say, well, it's because he was penetrating, pardon the rather blunt language, he was penetrating the bodies of women as a price they had to pay to get a role in a movie. Yeah, I would say yes, but weird as it may seem, and I'm grateful to my friend Frank Beckwith at Baylor for drawing this analogy to my attention. Imagine if Harvey Weinstein had been saying to these young women, you can have a part in my movie if you allow me to stick my finger in your ear. We would regard him as a weirdo creep. We may well regard him as somebody who deserved to do a bit of prison time. We would not regard him as the monster we do regard him as. Why? Because we know that sex and sexual contact is not just recreation. It's more serious than that. That's the vicious myth of pornography. It's not something that can be engaged in cost-free. When I was a pastor, I think of a particular young woman whose life was entirely shaped by the fact that her dad had committed adultery and cheated on her mum. It totally shaped her life. And the people that I knew when I was a pastor who had been subject to sexual assault. You know, if after this lecture one of you comes up and punches me on the nose, it'll hurt, and I'll be laughing about it in a week's time. I'll say, remember when I went to Westmont, that guy came up and punched me on the nose. Somebody sexually assaults you, you never joke about it. It never becomes something you joke about. It never becomes an after-dinner laugh. Why not? Because sex is not recreation. Sex goes to the depths of who we are. And that's why sexual assault is so bad. It's an assault on the body. But it's not just an assault on the body. It's an assault on the embodied self. When somebody sexually assaults you, put it this way, they take from you that which is only yours to give. And what is that thing? It is your very self. It is your very self. That's why sexual assault is, heinous. And what I'm glad about in the wake of the hashtag #MeToo movement and some of the books that are coming out now from those who you might have expected to support the sexual revolution is the realization that no, actually sex isn't just wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, walk away cost-free. It involves the very self. Because the human body is a sexual body. And when somebody takes that sexual aspect from you by force, they take your very self from you. That which is only yours to give is taken from you by force. We might say, you're kind of murdered at that point, only you're still living. The temptation of Mephistopheles is strong. Temptation of Mephistopheles to sell our souls for this technological power is strong, but ultimately the temptation of technology, the temptation of Mephistopheles, involves not just selling our souls, but selling our very selves as well. Thank you all for listening so patiently.
Thank you very much, Dr. Trueman. It was very, very, very interesting talk, very educating. I forgot to mention ahead of time, we had passed around cards, and if you need a pencil, there's some up here. But we'd love to take questions. We carved out some time for a Q&A, and please bring them, and we've got people going around to collect those and bring them up here to the stage, and Dr. Trueman would love to engage in some discussion. So raise your hand if you don't have a card, or if you need one, if you need a pencil, and we'll be able to provide that for you. Since I'm the organizer, and I'm going to take the prerogative of getting asked a question, I don't have a pen right here, but I'm in. Yeah, over here, Dr. Farhadian can do it, so please go ahead and collect those or bring them up here. I just wanted to come back to the social media bit, and I know, actually, Carl, I have an Instagram account, so I'm pretty hip, I'm with it.
You've gone down in my estimation.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I don't use it much, but I do have one. But I did want to kind of come back to that. I think it really is a very, in some of my courses in psychology, we're delving into this issue quite a bit, and the toxicity at a psychological level of kind of driving apart, wedging apart people, both in terms of, creating anxiety, creating comparison, fear of being left out as opposed to fear of missing out. And I'm just wondering, I try and get our students to think about it even from a Christian perspective. How do we grapple with that? Because it's so ubiquitous, it's so easy. We all find the advantages of it, but maybe circling back to that and things maybe you thought about on the issue of the...
Yeah. I think social media is, like a lot of technology, one could listen to my lecture and think, Trueman's a Luddite, he hates technology. Well, I do hate a lot of technology, it has to be said. But that's a personal thing. I don't think technology in and of itself is a bad thing. Social media is interesting. On one level, I've benefited from the internet in terms of it's reconnected me with friends from school that I haven't seen for many years, and that's been great fun. When social media starts to supplant what I would call real human relationships, it becomes problematic on a couple of fronts. I've not been involved in many face-to-face debates in my time. I've sat on a few panels with people I strongly disagree with. What's always interested me about those situations is that by and large the temperature tends to go down, believe it or not, on the whole in my experience. Because when you're an embodied presence next to another embodied presence, aggression and anger become more difficult. And also, there are all kinds of ways that human beings communicate, almost unconsciously, through our expressions, through our body language, that can help defuse situations. I don't do Twitter, but every Twitter battle I've ever looked at, I mean, even I use the term battle there, every Twitter encounter I've ever looked at on a controversial subject has tended to get hotter and hotter and hotter and less productive. So I think on one level, social media does not actually help constructive debate about the important issues of our day. You know, I want to say I'm aware there are probably people in this room who strongly disagree with some of my positions on things. Well, let me go on record as saying I have no vested interest in holding an incorrect opinion on anything. And if you think I have an incorrect opinion, then I think there's a moral obligation upon you to persuade me of a better way. And that doesn't happen with a Twitter pylon, typically. You know, since when does insulting somebody more and more from both sides of the debate ever lead to the person you're aiming at's conversion to your position? By and large, it doesn't. So I think Twitter is a problematic medium for dealing with serious kind of issues. On the anxiety front, I wrestle with this a lot because I teach 18 to 22-year-olds. They're the staple of Westmont College as well. And it breaks my heart in many ways, that, and the statistics are probably similar here, but I think at Grove City College, 40% of our kids will have connection with a counseling service at some point when they're at college. When I was at college in the 80s, we probably had a counseling service. I didn't know about it. Nobody ever told me about it. I never felt the need to go there. Why? Is it because kids today are somehow so much more thin-skinned or self-absorbed than they were in my day? No. What I think it is that in my day, I had a fairly stable social circle of people that I really connected with, that were able to affirm me. For somebody to feel that they are of value, somebody else has to treat them as somebody of value. And when you have a very small physical social circle, and they're the only guys who count, then being valued is relatively easy. If you're on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter and you have hundreds, maybe thousands of followers, and they're able to say anything they want about you without any cost to themselves, they will. And that's going to hurt. If you look to those things for your sense of self and for your confidence and for your sense of value, then those people have tremendous power over you. And it's a very unstable world as well. And the most heartbreaking things, you get them about once a year, you hear of a young guy or young girl who's committed suicide. And let me say, somebody who, relative of somebody who committed suicide, suicide it's in some ways far more damaging to a family than a terminal illness. Suicide rips the guts out of a family in a horrific way. And you hear these tragic stories of the young girl or the young guy who were bullied on the internet by some twerp that really meant nothing. And yet they so take this to heart that it leads them to think life is not worth living anymore. Those are really tragic stories. They wouldn't happen if our lives were more embodied. Now, how do we get out from under that? I don't know, but I think part of the solution has to be understand the way technology shapes your life and understand some of the problems that technology merely brings to your life. There are some technologies we use that they only really bring problems, and think critically about how you use them.
Thank you. I'm taking these in order. Consent to sex is consent to the risk of pregnancy is true only for women. Consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy has always been true for men. That asymmetry has been enacted in ways very damaging to women. Technology, for example, contraception, has mitigated that asymmetry. How do you suggest we navigate that asymmetry?
Yeah, that is an excellent point. And I think, again, it comes down to how you think about your body. And what I would want to do here, I think, is question whether the sexual revolution was really good news for women. I think that easy access to contraception and to abortion actually fueled the ability of men to treat women like objects. Now, that would be a completely different lecture. But what it's really done is it's allowed men to escape the consequences of sex, even more than in the past. Yeah, I could consent to have sex with a woman in the 19th century. Maybe she gets pregnant. Of course, I don't get pregnant, but she's got a family. We live in a village. There are means of holding me accountable for my action that I am going to think very long and hard about before I engage in that kind of activity. Now, I just make the girl get an abortion. So I think it's a very good point, and if I was giving a lecture on the sexual revolution, I'd certainly want to be addressing that. Again, though, I want to go back, I suppose, ultimately to the state of the body and say, yes, we're asymmetrical. Do we see that asymmetry as a burden? Or do we see it as something that is integral to who we are? And therefore, we need, well, not only to think about women in this, but to find ways of holding men to account for their behavior. And if anybody's interested, I would strongly recommend the book of Erika Bakayoko, the Catholic feminist, The Rights of Women. I think it's the best book of 2021. It's an excellent examination of the problem of asymmetry and how one might address that.
Next question. With your thoughts on transgender technologies, what are your thoughts on gender identity disorder? And then as a secondary question, do you think technologies are the only contributors to the world's problems, or are there other factors? Now that's a big question. So I'll let you decide how you want to tackle those.
On the first, I think on gender identity, or sort of gender dysphoria, I think we're too early in the stage of what's going on to really be able to opine with any kind of definitive answer on that. One thing I would say is my concern is for children in this. If you're a 25-year-old and you want to transition, I may disagree with your decision, but hey, you're an adult and it's a free country. And if the insurance company will pay for it, then it can be done. If it's 12-year-old, if it's somebody of an age that we don't allow to have a tattoo, asking, for example, to have their ovaries removed, making a decision about the rest of their life age 12, that's where my concern lies. That's where my concern lies on that. Second question?
Second was kind of broad, so maybe just a quick comment.
Yeah.
Let me just call it out here, sorry. Do you think technologies are the only contributors to the world's problems, or are there other factors?
Yeah.
I think that's a definitive.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, human beings, I think, have a significant role to play in all of this. I think technology is one of them. And I think that, given the topic of my lecture, I was really wanting to look at how technology has freed us up to think about certain ways about our bodies, et cetera, et cetera. But certainly the world's ills are not all rooted in technology. I think technology facilitates the speed and the magnitude of some of the Earth's ills. Human beings have always fought wars against each other. They've always butchered each other. They've always done horrible and inhuman things to each other. Technology has meant we can do that on a grand scale now. But I think human beings and our attitude towards other human beings and our attitude towards the environment, that's at the core of this.
Original sin. Okay, could say that too, yeah. Yeah, I'll leave that for my theologian friends. Let's say, for example, familial connections. Am I, quote unquote, obliged because of the genetic connection I have with my family, what I am, or the emotional connections I have formed with my family? Let me say that again. So am I obliged because of the genetic connection I have with my family, what I am, or the emotional connections I have formed with my family, what I would understand as who I am? Does that make sense? You kind of, I'll let you read it for yourself.
Oh, I see. Yeah, got you. I think both, and one of the burdens of my lecture really is to say that we can't drive such a wide wedge between the who and the what. yes, I think, sometimes people throw out that philosophical issue. You see two people drowning in the sea. One of them is your mother, the other's a complete stranger. Who do you dive in and save? Without a breath, I dive in and save my mum. And if I can go back and save the other person, I go back and save the other person. I think biological ties are strong and powerful, and they shape the who that we are. So I want to say it's both. Now, having said that, if you come from a family, I did not come from such a family. I was very blessed to come from a family where I was loved and cared for. If you come from a highly abusive family, I can certainly understand how the biological connection would get attenuated. And I would say that's because, of course, the biological connection isn't just a one-way obligation, it's a two-way obligation. I think parents have obligations to children, and children have obligations to parents. It's not, strictly speaking, a contract. It's not as easy to break as a contractual relationship. But certainly, if you are one of those people who has a monstrous parent who is completely delinquent relative to their obligations towards you, then that's going to be dramatically attenuated as a situation of obligation.
We've got three more that I haven't done here. So, how do you suggest we best combat this temptation and tendency towards transcendence that technology has influenced and restore the communal and tangible aspect we all need and desire? So kind of back to some of the themes of the counteracting, maybe the positive approach to it.
Can I?
Yes, I'll leave.
So I don't. I think it's hard to give a one-size-fits-all because different people have different tendencies, but I think one of the things that I have truly come to appreciate over the years is physical company. Do you spend all your time on the internet, or do you spend it in the company of real people? Early in our marriage, my wife and I decided that at 9 o'clock at night, after the kids had gone to bed, we'd have a glass of wine. You're allowed to talk about wine at Westmont? Okay, yeah.
It's after hours.
I suddenly thought, is it a Baptist institution? And sort of a panic button went off in my head.
We're in California, right?
Of course. So you probably have joints, I guess, after 9 o'clock at night. I don't know. But I think taking a joy in the simple pleasures of bodily existence with other people is part of that. Don't settle for the second best. Appreciate the people around you. One of the things my wife and I try to do once or twice a year is we go out for a nice meal. And we're always struck when we go out for a meal, we look at the other tables, and the other people are sitting there, they're all on their phones. And I'm thinking, oh, man, I'm not paying this money to go out with my wife to a restaurant and spend the evening staring at my phone. I want to stare at my wife, not in a creepy way, but I want to stare at my wife. I want to look at my wife and enjoy her company. So I think one of the ways we need to realize somehow we have to get back to the position where technology does not rule us, but we rule technology. Now that's hard, and I think it's harder for your generation than it is for my generation. I didn't do computers at school. Computers came into my life when I was already an adult. I've never had a great interest in hanging around on the internet. I've always preferred real life to virtual life. So it's relatively easy for me. I know it's much harder for the younger generation. But you need to reflect on who runs your life. Is technology a tool, or is it your master? And I think that's a question we all need to ask. And again, I think COVID sort of helps this way. I said in class today, who enjoyed COVID lockdown? Only weirdos enjoyed COVID lockdown. Even those who agreed with it as a policy knew that it was a rough thing, because it's not good that a 10-year-old boy dies alone. It's not good that my widowed mum doesn't get to use her voice for weeks on end because she never has another human being come by the house. We know that it may be necessary, but we know that's not good. I think what COVID might help us to see is real friendships, real connections with real people bring a lot of richness and value into our life. So I would say, ask yourself the question, does technology serve me, or do I serve technology?
This is getting back to the issue of the body embodiment. When you say sex is harmful to the body, to what extent does this harm apply to when in a marriage? So I think okay. Back to that.
Don't tweet me out as having said Trueman says sex is harmful to the body.
No,
Certain kinds of sex are harmful to the body. Now, when I was a pastor, the pastoral advice I would give to young couples was always this. Nothing should be done in the marriage bed that both parties aren't comfortable with. And I think we are all aware of very abusive marriages. And I think that particularly husbands have to be very sensitive to their wives on this front. So when I say sex harmful, well, I didn't say that, but to what extent does this harm apply when in a marriage? If you're engaged in any sexual relationship in any context that is doing physical damage to you, then I think that's problematic. And just because somebody is your husband or your wife does not give them the right to demand that you engage in that sort of behavior.
You mentioned technology, in particular social media, causing anxiety, or at least abnormal levels of anxiety in this generation. Are there many other things you would attribute to that rise? So maybe pushing past the,
I think I talked about this a little bit in one of the classes today. I think another reason for anxiety is that the world we live in is much more fluid now. Give some examples of that. The external markers that in the Middle Ages, for example, would have given somebody a firm sense of identity, family, place, these things are very fluid now. Of more recent vintage, things that gave people a sense of identity, nation, religious institution, these are very fluid now. The number of external markers that we can grab hold of as firm places to stand have disappeared. Populations are much more mobile now than they once were. If you'd been born in 1300, you wouldn't have moved more than 40 miles from where you were born, quite probably. You'd have known everybody you were going to know by the time you were 20, give or take the new births, etc. The world was very stable. The world now is a very fluid place. Add to that as well technology, not just in terms of social media, but in terms of ability to operate within society, is constantly changing. When I was trying to get my mother-in-law back to the UK 18 months ago, 15 months ago, just at the end of COVID, it was incredible. My mother-in-law's in her mid-70s, and she was getting incredibly distressed at the airport because guess what? She doesn't have a smartphone. So the Q codes and things that she was supposed to be using her phone on to enable her to get the documents that were allowed to fly back home, she couldn't get them because technology had swept away from her. When you're my age, your university college administrator every 4 or 5 years demands that you learn a new software package, which I have a cynical suspicion is merely solving problems that the last software package created. Well, that's disturbing because it means with my very fossilized brain in terms of technology as I'm getting older, I have to go back. I can no longer do my job well. I have to go back and learn stuff. And that creates anxiety. So I think there are a whole host of things in the modern world that have created anxiety. Not simply the instability of our friends and the instability of community, but what sociologists would call social acceleration. The fact that we can't stand still because everything's always sweeping away from us.
We'll do one more because we're getting on the end here. So this is, how are you defining technology? You stated people are only able to be transgender with technology, but people have lived lives opposite from their biological gender for the last several centuries, even before gender reassignment surgery was even a possibility. So are you including clothes as part of technology? Interesting perspective.
That's a good question. I hadn't thought of that. Thanks for that question. I guess I'm thinking in terms of how society imagines gender and the trans issue. If I could give an example, if let's say 100 years ago you'd gone to your doctor and said, I think I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, your doctor's response would have been, well, that's a problem. It's a problem of your mind. We need to treat your mind rather than your body. If you went to your doctor today, the doctor would give the opposite answer. It's a problem of your body. We need to treat your body, not your mind. What has made the difference? Well, in this case, medical technology. Medical technology has allowed us to think of the body as something over which we can exert tremendous power, even in terms of its sexual identity. That would have been unimaginable. Certainly don't want to deny that there were might say, individuals who transgressed societal norms on sex and gender over the past. Whether clothes fits into that. That's an interesting question. And I'm going to give this lecture again next week at the University of Kentucky. I'm going to work on that over the weekend. So thank you for that question. That's an interestingly provocative question that I need to think about. My instinct is to say yes, but I need to be certain.
Well, on that note, since you're always searching for the right question, so let's give Dr. Trueman a round of applause for his presentation again. So, thank you so much.